The film opens with an unsettling feeling in the air. 85-year-old Ellie is sitting alone in a cafe in New York. She keeps checking her watch over and over, as if she's waiting for something. Suddenly, the hands of the clock stop at exactly 7:59 and 55 seconds. A chilling smile spreads across Ellie's face, and she quietly leaves the cafe. She arrives at her best friend's house, where her friend's dead body lies inside. A birthday cake sits on a nearby table. Strangely, Ellie doesn't seem frightened at all. It's almost as if she already knew what she was about to find. She looks into a nearby mirror where a photograph of her friend's granddaughter is displayed. Scattered around the picture are locks of freshly cut hair. Seeing this, Ellie smiles once again. Then from the room behind her, the shadow of a naked woman slowly emerges. Instead of being terrified, Ellie looks delighted to see the pale woman. The mysterious figure hands her a small clay doll, and judging by the expressions on their faces, it's clear that they share a deep and ancient secret. The scene then shifts, and we're introduced to Sarah. Sarah is a famous model living in Paris. On the surface, she enjoys a glamorous and luxurious life, but deep inside, she's carrying a lot of emotional scars. Her parents died when she was a child, and after that, her grandmother Ellie raised her all by herself. After finishing work, Sarah calls her grandmother and tells her that she won't be able to come home for her birthday because of work commitments. Later, while enjoying a party hosted by her company, Sarah suddenly receives a phone call. It's from a hospital in Madrid. A nervous nurse informs her that her grandmother has been involved in a terrible accident. Although Ellie survived, she has fallen into a coma. Since Sarah is Ellie's only heir, she's asked to come to Madrid immediately. That same night, Sarah boards a flight. During the journey, she has a horrifying nightmare. In the dream, she sees her grandmother and her grandmother's friend laughing in a strange and disturbing way when she was a child. The atmosphere around them feels incredibly sinister. The dream leaves Sarah deeply unsettled, but she assumes it's just the result of stress. Little does she know, it was only a glimpse of the terrifying secret waiting for her. As soon as she arrives at the hospital, the doctor explains that the accident caused a ruptured blood vessel in Ellie's brain, making recovery almost impossible. He recommends transferring her to a nursing home. But when Sarah sees her grandmother helplessly sitting in a wheelchair, her heart breaks. She loves Ellie dearly and can't bear the thought of leaving her in a facility. Ignoring the doctor's advice, Sarah decides to take her grandmother back to her old apartment instead. Sarah believes she's simply doing her duty as a loving granddaughter. In reality, she has already stepped into the trap her grandmother carefully prepared for her. Sarah brings Ellie to the old apartment in Madrid. The moment she walks inside, she feels an overwhelming sense of unease. The house is dark, the plants have withered away, and the birdcage sits empty. But the strangest thing of all is that every mirror has been removed from the bathroom. Sarah can't understand why her grandmother would do such a thing, so she hangs her own small makeup mirror inside the bathroom without giving it much thought. The next day, as Sarah stood in front of the mirror getting ready, she noticed a single white strand growing among her thick, dark hair. For a model, finding gray hair was nothing short of a nightmare. It felt like the beginning of the end for both her beauty and her career. The sight of it filled Sarah with anxiety. Frustrated, she angrily plucked the white hair out. The moment she yanked it free, a loud scream suddenly came from her grandmother's room. Sarah rushed over and found her grandmother writhing in pain. Terror was written all over the old woman's face. A strange, foul odor had spread throughout the house. Because of her illness, Grandma had completely lost control of herself. Despite the unpleasant situation, Sarah didn't turn away in disgust. Like a caring granddaughter, she cleaned her up and even learned how to take care of her by watching videos. By the time everything was done, it was already past midnight. Sarah lay in bed scrolling through videos on her phone when she suddenly felt something move past her. Slowly, her blanket began to slide off on its own. Fear instantly gripped her. Standing in front of her was a blurry, naked figure, stretching a shriveled hand toward her. Sarah jolted awake with a gasp. Thankfully, it had only been a nightmare. But then her eyes drifted toward the bedroom door. It was slightly open, even though she was sure she had closed it before going to sleep. The next morning, while feeding breakfast to her grandmother, Sarah noticed the old woman suddenly burst into strange laughter while watching TV. Thinking the noise might be bothering her, Sarah turned the television off. But even after the screen went completely black, Grandma continued staring at it and laughing like a madwoman. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She was beginning to realize that something was seriously wrong in this house. That's when she noticed something even stranger. Every clock in the house had stopped at exactly 7:59, the same time Grandma's watch had frozen at the beginning of the story. Exhausted, Sarah went to take a shower. While she was bathing, the doorbell rang. Wrapped in a towel, she hurried outside and was surprised to find a young woman sitting beside her grandmother. Before Sarah could even ask who she was, the girl stepped forward and gave her a warm hug. Sarah was stunned. It turned out the girl was the granddaughter of Grandma's old friend, the very same blonde girl who had appeared earlier in the movie alongside the terrifying shadow figure. The blonde woman explained that she and Sarah had been childhood friends. She also claimed that whenever Sarah wasn't home, she was the one taking care of Grandma. That was why Grandma had given her a spare key to the house. The explanation left Sarah both surprised and suspicious, but she chose not to press the issue. Later that evening, after seeing the girl off, Sarah received an urgent message from work. She needed to return to the office as soon as possible. Sarah decided it was time to hire a caregiver for her grandmother. Unfortunately, after seeing Grandma's bizarre condition, nobody was willing to take the job. After a lot of effort, she finally managed to convince one person to come for an interview 2 days later. That evening, Sarah was sitting on the couch when she heard faint whispering coming from her grandmother's room. She went to investigate and found Grandma standing near the doorway, quietly talking to something that wasn't there. "Grandma, who are you talking to?" Sarah asked. But Grandma didn't answer. As Sarah approached the door, the lights suddenly went out. In the darkness, she froze in fear. But the moment the lights came back on, her grandmother was gone. Sarah rushed to the bed, only to find her grandmother lying there peacefully as if nothing had happened. Relieved, Sarah let out a deep breath and stepped out of the room. But as soon as she reached the hallway, the bedroom door slowly creaked open on its own behind her. Sarah went back inside and saw her grandmother trembling violently in bed. She assumed her grandmother needed help again, so she carefully moved closer. But the instant she pulled back the blanket, she let out a horrifying scream. Her grandmother's stomach was swelling like a balloon, growing larger and larger, as if something alive was trapped inside and desperately trying to claw its way out. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her phone and called an ambulance. But before the call could even connect, her grandmother suddenly returned to normal. Just like that, as if nothing had ever happened. Sarah stood there completely stunned. Somehow she managed to calm herself down, tucked a blanket around her grandmother, and returned to the couch. But fear kept her awake the entire night. The next morning, Sarah discovered an old diary from her childhood. It was filled with memories of birthdays she had celebrated with her grandmother. But hidden behind those happy memories was a dark and terrifying secret. While reading the diary, Sarah uncovered a shocking detail. She and her grandmother shared the exact same birthday, March 22nd. She remembered her 8th birthday when her grandmother had invited an old friend and that friend's granddaughter, the blonde-haired girl, to their house. That day they were given a strange red drink. It smelled wonderful, but the taste was oddly unpleasant. Afterwards, Sarah's grandmother and her friend each cut a small lock of hair from Sarah and the blonde girl, claiming it was simply a keepsake. Little did young Sarah know that the conspiracy against her had begun when she was only 8 years old. Later, Sarah went outside to throw away the trash and noticed her grandmother quietly watching television. She stayed outside for a while to get some fresh air, but when she returned home, her grandmother had vanished. Sarah searched every room in the house. She looked for her day and night, but there was no sign of her anywhere. Exhausted and desperate, Sarah finally returned home and began shouting for help. That's when she saw her grandmother sitting silently in the hallway. Sarah repeatedly asked where she had gone, but her grandmother refused to answer. At dinner, her grandmother once again started laughing in that same terrifying voice. Sarah was already terrified, and now her patience was wearing thin. That night, when she went to bed, one strange event after another began to unfold. Suddenly, 2 bright flashes of light, like a camera flashes, struck her hand. Sarah looked down and her heart nearly stopped. Her young hand had become dry, wrinkled, and old. Her teeth began falling out. Her black hair turned completely white in a matter of seconds. Overwhelmed with terror, Sarah collapsed onto the floor. And then, near the doorway, she saw the shadow of that same blonde-haired girl. Suddenly, Sarah's eyes snapped open. Thank God, it had only been another nightmare. But the moment she looked around, a terrified scream escaped her lips. She wasn't sleeping in her own bed. She was lying in her grandmother's bed. The sight completely shattered Sarah. She began screaming hysterically and rushed toward her grandmother's room, trembling with fear. When she stepped inside, she found her grandmother peacefully asleep, clutching a strange stuffed toy in her hands. By now, Sarah had reached her breaking point. She wanted to get out of this house as fast as possible. Immediately, she started searching for flights to Paris. Just then, the doorbell rang. The caregiver Sarah had hired had finally arrived. As soon as the caregiver entered the house, she noticed Sarah's grandmother sitting beside an empty birdcage, quietly mumbling to herself. The caregiver gently tried to start a conversation, but the old woman remained completely motionless, like a statue. Sarah felt a sense of relief. At least now someone could look after her grandmother, and she would finally be able to return to Paris and save her career. She was about to step outside for some fresh air when she noticed her grandmother standing by the window, making strange gestures into the air. The moment Sarah looked down from the window, her blood ran cold. She rushed downstairs and discovered that the very caregiver who had just left the house had been involved in a horrific car accident. When Sarah looked back up at the window, her grandmother was staring directly at her, as if silently saying, "You're never leaving me." Sarah was completely devastated. Remembering what the doctor had said, she decided to place her grandmother in a nursing home. After leaving her there, she thought everything would finally be okay. Back at home, Sarah was cooking dinner while talking to her boss on the phone, explaining that she would soon be returning to Paris. But the moment she cracked eggs into a frying pan, a piercing scream echoed from the television. Breaking news flashed across the screen. A massive fire had engulfed the nursing home where she had left her grandmother. According to the report, no one inside had survived. Everyone had burned to death. Sarah was crushed with grief and guilt. Convinced that her decision had caused her grandmother's death, she even considered donating money to the nursing home. As Sarah packed her belongings and prepared to leave, a horrifying realization struck her. No matter where she went in the world, she could never escape her grandmother. She finally understood that none of this was a coincidence. It was a curse that had been tied to her the moment she was born. By now, Sarah's heart had turned cold. She stopped caring for her grandmother with love and instead began force-feeding her, shoving huge amounts of food into her mouth. Her grandmother started choking and desperately struggling for air, but Sarah seemed possessed by rage. She walked out of the room, hid behind the door, and broke down in tears. When she finally returned, her grandmother was dead. Just then, Sarah's phone rang. It was her birthday, and her grandmother's birthday too. Sarah called the hospital and informed them that her grandmother had passed away. But then her eyes fell on that old photograph she had seen earlier. Before, the picture showed her grandmother standing beside the blonde-haired girl. Now, as if by some dark magic, her grandmother had vanished from the photo, and Sarah herself was standing there instead. Sarah's mind was spinning when the phone suddenly rang again. "Hello, who is this?" she asked nervously. A voice answered from the other end. "I'm Ellie. I'm Susanna." At that exact moment, every light in the house went out. Sarah quickly turned on her phone's flashlight so she could look at her dead grandmother's face. That's when she noticed a strange glow coming from the other side of the hallway. Gathering her courage, she walked toward it and discovered a candle burning beneath her grandmother's portrait. As Sarah bent down to blow out the candle, her flashlight beam landed on a hidden drawer in the table. The drawer had somehow opened on its own. Inside, she found an old childhood photograph of herself along with a lock of her cut hair. The exact same thing she had seen earlier at her grandmother's friend's house. And then it all clicked. Sarah finally understood the entire game. She remembered why she had been given that red drink on her 8th birthday and why her hair had been cut. It hadn't been a celebration at all. It had been part of a horrifying soul transfer ritual. Now Sarah realized that the lock of hair, her grandmother's accident, and even the reason she had been called back home weren't coincidences. Every single event had been part of her grandmother's carefully planned scheme. When Sarah stepped out of the room, her grandmother was gone. She searched for her and headed toward the bathroom. But suddenly the door slammed shut and the ceiling began to crack apart. Sarah barely managed to escape. But by then she knew one thing for certain. Her grandmother was never going to let her leave alive. Suddenly Sarah collapsed to the floor. She could hear a doctor's voice somewhere in the distance. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't respond. Then her dead grandmother slowly approached her and began making strange gestures in the air. She leaned closer and blew a ghostly, smoke-like breath into Sarah's mouth. The moment Sarah inhaled it, her breathing stopped. And then, as the lights came back on, a miracle, or perhaps a nightmare, occurred. Sarah's lifeless body suddenly stood up. But the soul inside it was no longer Sarah's. It was her grandmother. The empty vessel had finally been filled. Now trapped inside her grandmother's old body, Sarah sat helplessly beside her. Moments later, the blonde-haired girl entered the room and stared at Sarah's new body the same way the grandmother had stared at her at the beginning of the film. The truth was finally revealed. The grandmother had faked both her death and the accident for one reason only: to make Sarah feel guilty enough to return home. Coming back home had been the final step of the ritual, and the key to the entire ceremony had been hidden in Sarah's birthday, because only on that specific day could the terrifying, soul-swapping ritual be completed. With this, the story ends here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Also subscribe to this channel for more stories like this.